Welcome to the Animal Heartbeat. This is the world's greatest and only podcast dedicated to veterinary cardiology. I am Kieran Bourget.
And I'm Jose Novomatos.
Hi, everyone. Our guest today is Dr. Giulio Menciotti. Giulio is an ACVM and ECVM diplomate in cardiology and Hunter Endowed Professor in Veterinary Cardiology at Virginia, Maryland University. We'll be talking today about three-dimensional echo in veterinary cardiology. Giulio, it's great to have you here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me, guys.
I'm excited for this because, excited and also a little anxious because I'm very much on the early part of the learning curve on my 3D echo journey. The first question that we want to ask is when do you use 3D echo in your day-to-day clinical practice? But actually, I'd like one question before that. Do you say 3D or 4D?
Very good question. I think I say a 3D. Also the real time is something that sometimes I add, and then whenever we go out with the paper, it always gets the editors or the reviewers. They always want their own specific language. But I usually just go like 3D echo.
I've certainly had some people confused when you say, "Oh, we've done a 3D echo," and they say, "Oh, on your website, it says 4D. Okay, it means the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. They use 4D. They must be much better than you guys. 3D, but yeah.
Yeah, it's like intergalactic 3D or something.
Exactly. Yes, I think the time portion is the fourth dimension, but 3D then for the 2D because it always also uses time. I don't know. Yeah. 3D. I think it's clear to most.
I think we can say 3 or 4, right? For the purposes of this discussion, can't we? Okay.
Yes.
Great. Okay. So when do you reach for 3D echo in your day-to-day clinical practice? Is it a standard tool or is it an add-on for you?
Yeah, it's definitely an add-on. We don't charge extra, but it's an add-on tool, meaning that in daily cardiology practice, 3D isn't ubiquitous, obviously, yet. But where technology is available, it has found niche in several areas. It may be in the next years something that we do want to reach for in almost every patient, in the vast majority of patients. For example, in mitral disease dogs, the volume overload distorts that ventricular geometry. 3D theoretically is going to give us a more faithful representation of chamber size and allow us to locate through apex. Just think about, for example, all the differences in shape of our patients and different in shape in their hearts, both when they're normal and when they distort. So I would say left ventricular volume is probably one of the major areas of expansion, at least. Left atrial volume is the second one. It may carry the same importance for us, moving beyond just mono or bidimensional measurements towards real volumetric measurements. It's particularly as our understanding of left atrial remodeling and its prognostic significance improves. Then the third most important thing is mitral valve morphology. With 3D echo, we can look at the valve just like a surgeon would, and in more and more cases, as the availability expand, we can look at the valve as the surgeon will look at it. So we can give a more thorough description of this valve and the parts that will need to be assessed and fixed for surgical intervention, and even with minimal invasive intervention, I think three-dimensional echocardiography, following again the path of human medicine, it's going to become key.
Cool. Giulio, before we're going to dive in each of those areas that you mentioned, because that's really interesting, and that's exactly what I think everyone is interested about. But before we do that, can we just discuss a bit technical considerations and some practical tips? I guess the first thing that maybe most people be worried about is acquisition time. How long does it take to acquire the full data set? And then related to that is also observer variability. How steep is the learning curve and how high is the observer variability with 3D echo? Can you share with us a bit, your opinion and experience on this?
Yeah, I mean the actual acquisition time for even a full volume multi-beat data sets, it's just a few seconds, right? It all comes then to the patient preparation, optimizing the 2D image, adjusting the sector, acquiring more than one data set for quality selection, and dealing with the issues that sometimes adds that. I would say in general, now that we are in our clinic, in our laboratory, that we are proficient with it, probably adds 5 to 10 minutes to a standard echocardiography, to the standard echo study. This is for the acquisition part. Post-processing analysis then adds further time on top of that. So tracing endocardial borders, depending on what you want to do, tweaking the setting of the visualization, creating models and cast, adjusting the tracings and things like that. So, but then as well, I can see how a trainee maybe at the beginning spends, let's say for a ventricular volume, 5 to 10 minutes, then for the first data set, when arrives at the 20th, those becomes like 3 to 5 minutes max.
Okay, that's cool. That's fast. But then let's say in a well-oiled machine like your Echo Lab on 3D, how does your variability compares between 3D and 2D volumes, for example?
Yeah, again, the lesson that we learn, the one from human medicine, is that training is very important, right? And we have a few peculiarities of 3D. For LV volumes, we do know actually that 3D echocardiography has got less variability than 2D echocardiography when you perform it start to finish, meaning that if it's two different observer acquiring the same patient, 3D echo gets rid of all the issues about finding true apex and foreshortening and all of that. And so it's got less variability than 2D echo. It then comes to tracing endocardial border. I think you're all familiar with the first, 50 echocardiograms that we have performed, even with 2D, right? With a supervising diplomate that's like behind your shoulders and like, that's not endocardium, keep going, or vice versa. And particularly like even in M mode, for example, right? It's like, and so I think the standardization helps a lot, but once that is done, the variability is actually less than two-dimensional echocardiography.
It's taking one factor out of that equation, isn't it? That acquisition plane that, of course, is so vital with 2D. It takes that away if you have got that quality 3D data set. And I emphasize that because they're not all quality, or at least not in my hands anyway. Certainly transthoracic, I think there are some real challenges in getting a great acquisition there that you'd be happy to maybe show in a lecture or put in a textbook, that high standard imaging where it's very intuitive to look at. Have you got any tips on that? Do you have any limitations in terms of patient size or probe choice or anything like that would get in your way of achieving those high standard images?
Yeah, absolutely. Are they all quality? No, I would say obviously no. But that's another thing that we have learned. We have seen in early studies that the percentage of quality data sets acquired clearly increased with our experience with the machine. And so there is some part of it that it's not just due to our patient, obviously. Again, very similar to 2D. It's often it's often easy to blame our equipment, right? I
Bad
keep remembering.
workman blames their
Yeah, I
crew.
keep remembering the first horse that we echo, or the first the first brachycephalic dog. Like, it's not working.
Which
I need
machine
to
is
change
this?
the setting. Yeah, what is that? But yeah, it gets better at this point. For dogs, we have close to 100% of data sets that are analyzable, and we focus on mitral valves and left-sided volumes for now. And we are just coming out, our third-year resident just coming out from the CAT experience, and so I can tell you that too, we had the same learning curve, but when things get when we got used to it, that quality data sets can be acquired in the vast majority of our patients. I can talk to you about tips or tricks if you want. It gets a little technical, so I don't know if you want to break it down.
I think there are people who are here for the technical stuff. That certainly would be useful for us.
The first thing I think, obviously, it's getting good 2D images. What most, if not all, the platforms that I work with show you when you start your 3D acquisition is actually a couple of orthogonal 2D planes. If those don't look good, or even the single image before you hit the 3D button, you cannot expect 3D to do the magic. 3D is going to look worse than that. So
3D is a series of 2D slices, right? I mean, that's what it is. So therefore, if your 2D is not good, it follows your 3D will also not be good.
yeah, I think the kind of viewfinder, you can think about the 2D before you hit the 3D button as a viewfinder, right? You can't work miracles through a bad acoustic window. And the probes are a little bigger. They have a little bit of a larger footprint. And so finding that acoustic window sometimes is a little trickier than with most 2D probes. We see it even with 2D. Every time we get a newer machine, it seems like it's playing some sort of magic for which it gets easier and easier, right? The probe does a lot of your work. So we're kind of back in time a little bit with the 3D probes, in which you got to work a little harder to optimize that. But the first step would be that one. Get a nice, good, sharp 2D image that signifies that you have found your good acoustic window. Once you've found that, locking your probe in place is key, and then there's a lot of technical factors in which you want your presets to be optimized. You want to play with the presets a lot. I always encourage our trainees to try and press every button of the machine and see what it does, right? With some understanding of the physics behind it. The biggest challenge that we have, challenges are from the patient size and their heart rate. The main disadvantage currently for 3D echocardiography is the frame rate. Actually, the volume rate is the equivalent of the frame rate. And we are dealing with patients that have decently high frame rate. But the engineering has come a long way and has come out with some good tools that help us minimize that challenge. Most of the data sets that we acquire, both in dogs and in cats, are multi-bit acquisition. And when you do a multi-bit acquisition, what the probe is doing, the machine and the probe are doing, is they only acquire small sectors at the time, and then it just assumes that if the heart rate stays consistent at X milliseconds from the QRS, the heart is going to be at the same phase of the cardiac cycle. And so I can acquire just a small sector for each heartbeat and then stitch together these sectors to create an image that is got decent. We are talking about now up to 30, 40 frames per second. So a decent temporal resolution and with higher spatial resolution. So that would be like one of the most important thing, and minimizing the movement both of the heart and your probe between those. It's key. Sometimes the regularity of the heart rate is another very important thing, and so sometimes, interestingly, we deal with a semi-unique challenge of sinus arrhythmia, right? Which
Right.
we always think about it as like a great thing when we see a dog that's got like sinus arrhythmia. It's kind of like a safe haven for us. But for 3D echocardiography, that's actually a little challenging, which means that if your R to R intervals obviously keep varying, then the heart will not be at the same phase of the cardiac cycle at X plus 20 or 40 or 60 milliseconds from the QRS in different heartbeats. And so sometimes, interestingly, having a higher heart rate, because you got rid of the sinus arrhythmia, it's your friend.
Right.
And so it's not unusual that we would actually try and stimulate our patient, our dog, if he's got sinus arrhythmia, and trying to get rid of the sinus arrhythmia. And even if we have a higher heart rate as a number of the machine, we are going to have much better looking and a better quality data sets, because we can use that multi-beat acquisition versus just a single beat acquisition. And recognizing this limitation, I think it's something, again, that comes with that learning curve and that experience, like recognizing that you don't have to always use the same protocol. Sometimes having a 30 frame per second but bad quality full volume data set is not as valuable as a single beat and maybe 10, 15 frame per second single beat acquisition, because maybe the patient's heart rate is low, it's got sinus arrhythmia, just use the single beat acquisition versus just sticking to a single method, multi-beat for all of them, and then you are aiming for the higher heart rate, but when you go back and look, all your data sets need to be discarded because they're all badly staged.
And your respiratory cycle must also affect things, surely, because you'll get some respiratory motion there. How do you overcome that? Do you have any tips for overcoming that in your conscious patient on the echo table?
Yeah, that's a little more challenging. I think sedation can help, obviously, with both. Need to be careful, obviously, that with some sedation protocols, you may end up with that sinus arrhythmia that you don't like that much. But other things like the classic breath hold, closing one nostril sometimes helps decrease that respiratory rate. Having somebody that maybe blows on the face of the patient during those 4 beats of acquisition. So it's kind of simulating a breath hold. Those are all like small tricks that help. But you're absolutely correct. The respiratory movement is another thing that everything that changes the position of that heart beat to beat will be affecting your multi-beat acquisition. All of these considerations do not affect single beat acquisition.
Okay.
Now, there's other things like classic things that are the same as 2D that sometimes are forgotten too, because what I see often is that the 3D button is kind of like the magic box, and everything else gets kind of left behind sometimes. But things like optimizing your sector, for example, your sector width, optimizing your depth, optimizing your focus position. Again, kind of going back a little bit to the older echo machines that you have to do a little more of that manual work, right?
Well, you have to work harder, right?
Yeah, you have to work harder, but those things are very important because it can make a difference. Optimizing your sector, for example, in a 2D probe nowadays with our frame rate, we don't care that much, right? Going from 100 frame per second to 120 doesn't make a huge difference.
Yeah,
but it could make a difference on 3D between 20 frame per second and 30 frame per second, and that's like a 50% increase in volume rate. And so optimizing your gains, optimizing your sector, optimizing your depth and your focus position, those are, again, things that are still very important when acquiring with 3D probes.
Yeah, we all got a bit lazy nowadays, right? What you're saying is really interesting because everything is so easy to acquire. The images are so sharp and neat that you don't need to touch any button, as you were saying, to have a pretty good 2D image. So that's already a good argument to start trying 3D, just that we all try to optimize our images and so on. Yeah. So if we start talking about LV volumes, as you said, that's one of the main applications and something that people will certainly be excited about it. We all see cardiac MRI as the gold standard. Can you share with us some of your data and data from other groups on how 3D volumes, LV volumes, compare with MRI data?
Yeah, first of all, I mean, MRI, cardiac MRI, it's even less diffuse than 3D echocardiography, right? It's the gold standard, but that limits, unfortunately, the data that we have available to a handful of healthy beagles, to the best of my knowledge. And so we need to be very careful when we interpret that data, because we are talking about a handful of healthy beagles that are under anesthesia, and so all that data, which is extremely valuable, and the groups that are working on that are fantastic group, and kudos to them for doing that job, because it helps us create the pathway that we are following. Again, probably from human medicine, we know that 3D for LV volumes, it's the best performing non-invasive technique. So when we consider a cardiac MRI as the gold standard, the 3D is the one that tracks the best, so correlates the best. And not only that, is the one with the narrowest limit of agreement, which means that if you were to guess what the real volume is compared to cardiac MRI, 3D is going to be your best bet. If you put together that information with the variability bit that we just talked about, it should be kind of a no-brainer how important that is and how that can be important for stratifying our patients. We know that it still slightly underestimates absolute volumes, and it's a little. If you read the few papers that are out there, it's interesting how for some chambers it seems to underestimate the volume, particularly for right chambers. For left chambers, it's a little. Sometimes it seems to underestimate, sometimes to overestimate volumes. But it seems to me that when we look at these healthy beagles, the differences are clinically relevant. Now, it will all hinge on how these data points would spread when you have left ventricular enlargement, right? Which is where we really
pathology.
Yeah, it is what we will really care about going forward. So using the very good data that we have as a base and as a stepping point, I think we are familiar with the behavior of some of these tests and technology to go with trends in which then when you look at extremes, which probably for us is going to be the patients that we care about, let's say the ones with left ventricular enlargement or the ones with left atrial enlargement, then those data could spread more significantly. We don't know. And so we could not, at this point, we cannot assume that those limits of agreement and that predictability, it's going to be the same in dogs with different shapes of their ventricles, different remodeling stages. But I think, again, from the human experience and this handful of beagles, it seems like three-dimensional echocardiography is going to be your best bet for comparing to a gold standard.
Mitral valve disease is one of your research focus and clinical work. We pretty much in every podcast, we talk about B1 versus B2, how to quantify mitral regurg and so on. So how do linear dimensions compare with 3D echo? Can the LV volumes give you more information on knowing what is early mitral valve disease versus later asymptomatic mitral valve disease?
Well, the provocative answer there would be that it must give you more information. It must give you. It's got more dimensions, right? It's going to give you more. No, but I think it gets to the main issue of how much data we have available, which is always our main limitation in veterinary medicine. We use those linear dimensions not because they mean something compared to the real volume of the dog, because we know that they have a predictability. We know that they have an effect for which they have a meaning. We know that those dimensions mean that you may benefit from a certain drug. We know that those dimensions mean that you may go into heart failure earlier. We know that those dimensions mean that you may die sooner or later, or you may need more support or a closer look from your owners and from your cardiologist. That is something that cannot and should not, in my opinion, be disregarded. Let's make for example, I always, when I talk to trainees or people at conferences, let's make the absurd idea that your 3D echocardiography, it's going to give you left ventricular volumes that are always wrong by 50 milliliters, which for our world is a lot, right? Well, if I show you that LV volume predicts survival and predicts occurrence of heart failure and predicts the response to a drug better than your LAO, you would not care whether it's the real volume or not, right? And so to me,
outcome trumps the theory, doesn't it? There.
Yeah. So to me, the value of those linear dimension is something that it's there to stay for a long time. It doesn't mean that we cannot do better, right? I think we see it coming up with this different, the push for different staging of mitral regurgitation and mitral valve disease. We have a couple of interesting papers either published or coming up in the special edition of JVC now on the AV valves, in which you can really see how there is that huge shift, somewhat pushed by interventional procedures for mitral valve disease, but also I think by the fact that these measurements have aged. Of course, they do perform very good, so I don't think we should abandon them. But can we build on them and use those plus other things so that we can stratify them even better? So we know, let's say, for example, that our pulmonary hypertension, your TR velocity estimated gradient of 55 stratifies dogs that live more or less with mitral disease, right? Well, can we find something that maybe stratifies 3 groups so that we can predict even better your outcome and have a more precise outcome? And I think that's where a lot of 3D volumes are going to sit. We're going to find that through your linear dimension, divide maybe your population into 2 groups, but the health volumes may divide them into 4. And when you are a dog owner or a pharmaceutical company that wants to develop a drug that helps even the small group to shift, let's say, a curve, these things are going to become more and more important. So the stratification of your population, I think it's where we can move not away, but build on these linear dimensions.
It's hard to disagree that a 3D volume should give you more information than a 2D linear, 1D measurement of atrial size. What about function? I mean, obviously we're aware about the predictive benefit of left atrial motion function in cats for ATE, for example. Is this something that you or others have looked at in real-time 3D, that the functional assessment of not just the ventricle but the atrium?
Yeah, this is something that we're working on now. As I mentioned, we are coming out of the cat experience. We are generating the first step of everything. We're generating normative data for these patients, and that's, again, it's a tedious work, but without normative data, that's another limitation that we have so far for the applicability of 3D, because when you don't know what's normal, it's difficult to define abnormal and how much you can catch, right? So I think it will have, again, that stratification, function. The 3D may be able to catch that. It all plays into the game about variability and reproducibility, meaning what do you define as a real change, right? And what do you define as a real change? I think we're all familiar. I always bring up the example of the number of VPC in a halter, right? When you start an intervention, it seems like it's changed a lot, but if it is within what you expect, just stochastically or because of your lab's variability or things like that, then it may not have clinical significance. And I think with 3D showing us that there is better reproducibility, it's got the potential of narrowing those margins of clinical significance.
So just quickly, because when we were talking about the technical bits and tips and so on, we didn't mention that, because something that people would raise frequently is the concerns about that different vendors will give you different results, or different echo machines will give you different results, and then the reference ranges are not vendor agnostic, and then people are not sure how to extrapolate them. Can you comment on that? How important is different vendors for acquiring the images and so on?
Yeah, that's very true. There is very well documented bias between different vendors, and that's another project of my PhD student almost completed. We show that even just for mitral valve morphologic analysis, acquiring datasets with different machines does play a role. I think, though, a lot of that can be at least minimized by a third-party offline analysis software, meaning that when we are talking about the best example is strain, both 2D and 3D. Strain, whenever you have a black box, we call it software, in which you press a button and the machine gives you a number as a result without you having control of what's in between, that's when you should worry the most about variability between platforms. When you have software, though, that can work on images acquired with different vendors, and you always use the same software for calculating volumes that are acquired with machines of different vendors, then I think the variability shrinks versus using the machine, so what we call on-cart. So the machine and the software, the 3D software on the machine for generating, for example, volumes or measurements of structures like AV valves and things like that. So it's definitely something to take into account. Again, the differences there are there, whether they are clinically relevant or not, I'm not very sure at this point. It will all play out again in what we find, what we will find that is clinically relevant. For example, if we find that you need a change of 20 mils of end-diastolic volume for your prognostic importance, and then the difference between machines is about 5 mils, then it probably doesn't matter, right?
Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? And I guess it comes down to, as well, just knowing what normal day-to-day variation is, because if the variability day-to-day is the same or more than the software variability, well, okay, we can forget about the software variability.
Yeah, you can't forget some of these, they compound on each other, though, right?
Yeah, it's true.
And so you need to be a little wary of that when you look at observer, for example, and inter-machine and inter-day variability, I think we need to remember that they do compound, meaning that I could not expect one to be estranged from the other. If it is two operators that look at one dog on 2 different days, you need to add to actually multiply the two coefficients of variation or the variability whenever you want to interpret it together.
Yeah.
We talk about volumes and linear dimensions, and as you were saying, a volume is better than a linear dimension. I talk about the 3D structure and blah, blah, blah. But then how would the 2D volume compare to the 3D volume? So based on the data you have been working on and publishing, how much more accurate do you think a 3D volume is from a 2D volume? And just to add to this question, because I think what is interesting is, I think the first papers on 3D echo in veterinary cardiology maybe were published, 10, 15 years ago. And you would expect this to explode, right? You'd expect that people start using 3D echo all the time. And maybe back in the days, the probes were huge and so on and not very handy. But now the footprint is so neat. The probes are smaller, like 2D probes. So I think my question is, how do 2D volumes compare with 3D volumes? And what, in your opinion, has been the hurdles to implement 3D echo in clinical practice?
Yeah, I think so. The accuracy kind of a hierarchy in humans is well established. You have cardiac MRI, that is your gold standard. Then a little less accurate, but your best bet, like I said, is 3D echo. Then you would have to go to biplane Simpsons, or then area length, and then single plane Simpsons, and then linear dimensions. I don't know how many of us do Simpson biplane, for example, because it's time consuming. And I think the main hurdles, like you said, it was probe sizes. Now that the probe size has been fixed, let's say we have both adults and pediatric probes, some of these vendors, they don't even have certain frequencies now available in not 3D fashion, for example. They would just sell you the one that does also 3D. But then the two main things to me are the frame rate at this point and the lack of normative data and prognostic data. And that, like you said, it's a process that you would expect to explode, but I think particularly with how the publications progress in veterinary medicine, I think we are still kind of on the flat beginning of that curve. I think they will explode. I do these every once in a while. I think about every once a year or 2 years. The PubMed does give you a little graph of the number of publications for your keys. And so if you do three-dimensional echocardiography in dogs, for example, you do see that the publications are increasing, kind of following that exponential curve. But nonetheless, we don't have very good clinically relevant data quite yet. I think once we're going to have that, and at the same time, the technology is going to come in the same direction to help us, and at the same time, the software is going to become faster and more accurate, I think that's going to be easier and easier. I'll give you an example. For larger dogs, for example, our machine has got the software, the human software for what is called the dynamic heart model or whole heart model. It's kind of fun also to show the students. And that obviously is optimized for people. It's got some components of artificial intelligence for which the more you use it, the better it gets. You acquire one image, a full volume acquisition of your heart. You hit one button, and within 20 seconds, the machine has left ventricular and diastolic volume and systolic volume, speckle tracking left atrial, diastolic and systolic volume, ejection fraction, and all that shebang. And again, the tracking accuracy, it's it's pretty good, particularly with larger dogs, with sizes that start resembling people. And so you see, when that becomes a convenience rather than extra work, but it's saving you work, because I oftentimes, when I have those larger dogs with how is this ejection fraction? It seems like it's borderline, and then you hit the button, and within 20 seconds, without tracing anything, without your trackball getting stuck on the apex and having to trace back and
Because that's
those
my
things.
experience of doing those, is you trace the three orthogonal or three planes. And
Yes, exactly. But it gives you a number, and you look at the trace, because it always gives you control on that. And you look at the trace and you see, like, yeah, those are actually the endocardial border. It's following them, it's tracking them. Again, it's hard not to believe the number. And maybe, obviously, before I write my report, I'm going to measure it another 2 or 3 ways and compare with normal data and everything. But that's when it starts to become a convenience rather than an inconvenience to use.
yeah.
And I think that's going to be a big step forward.
Yeah, and I think if it's better on the repeatability and reflects the reality better and is convenient, that combination is the magic combination. I guess the final thing missing is cost effective, because there's a price on all of these things, aren't there? I mean, the vendor independent software is another expense. The licenses for the machine or for the software, that they're all additional to having the 3D probe. You need to then buy the capacity to do the measurements and do everything else. And I think from my perspective, that certainly has been a challenge in trying to expand our 3D capability, is to say, okay, guys, here's the business case. This would be really neat. It would make us really happy. Well, that's not a business case. So you have to then look at it in terms of time, of capacity, and I think one of the things that is sort of very clear is that assessing mitral valve morphology, opening up capacity for interventional treatments or surgical treatments, that's something that is going to force some centers to adopt 3D echo. Tell us a little bit about mitral valve morphology, because I know this is a bit of a passion project of yours, and something that I've seen you speak about very beautifully before and illustrate.
Thank you.
Just try and briefly describe for us the differences in mitral valve morphology that you see. Well, I guess first of all, in normal dogs, what's the spectrum of normal, and is there a difference with breeds? And then how is that changed by myxomatous mitral valve disease?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I would probably, if you allow me, I will address the first point of the economic proficiency of it. I think you're absolutely right that all of these things, they have a cost, and it's hard to justify when there is no return on that investment, right? So I think that added value of either having normative data or opening up to possibility or capabilities that you didn't have before, it's going to be key. I think the clear example that we have seen now, it's obviously mitral valve interventions, but not only that, also things like left atrial decompression, in which I think the message from the LA group has been clear since the beginning that 3D echo, it's pretty much for them, at least when I heard them speak, it's needed. You need to have the capability, and the other important thing is that you need to master that capability. And so one economical investment, you could see it as is adopting it early, so that you could get familiar with the technology, so that you're ahead of the learning curve whenever your lab or your cath lab or your practice is going to open up for those.
Completely makes sense. Yeah.
The added value, for example, of being able to evaluate the rims of an atrial septal defect, so that you can now occlude the non-invasive atrial septal defect, is something that not only gives you the economical value of that one procedure, but obviously it's got all those that trickle down effect on now you can offer the procedure, which means that your practice it's going to be a tertiary referral rather than a secondary referral, for example. And all of these things, I think it's difficult to monetize on a single, for example, piece of software that you're buying or an extra probe and things like that. But it does have that trickle down effect. And a lot of it, it's very clear lately again for mitral valve intervention. Like you said, it's a little bit of a passion of mine. I started with this idea of Michele Borgarelli that is my mentor, and I did my PhD with, and now I'm fortunate enough to call a colleague and a friend that the mitral valve shape matters, and the mitral valve shape matters from the disease perspective, not only from the intervention perspective. So the idea that there is some changes that are either cause of consequence of the myxomatous process. Our idea now is that they're a causative for the myxomatous process, at least contribute to the myxomatous process. We know that normally the mitral valve, it's got this fancy shape, hyperbolic paraboloid, which the non-fancy way to describe it is the classic shape of a Pringles, right? That shape. That's a hyperbolic paraboloid. It's got very practical implication, if you wish. The most important practical implication that we have seen in human medicine, from human medicine, 20 years ago when this was described, is the recognition of mitral valve prolapse. Because of that shape that we have described, also be in dogs, their standard echocardiographic plane, some standard echocardiographic planes that do not include the aorta, the left ventricular outflow tract, naturally overemphasize some prolapses or create false prolapses. There's a few interesting papers in human medicine when this was recognized, the prevalence of mitral valve prolapse in people decreased exponentially because a lot of those people did not have prolapse, right? And as we have the push for mitral valve interventions to become more and more widely available, the push for trying and fix the problem earlier and earlier and earlier, like we have seen again in humans, I think these things are going to be key. And the complex assessment of the mitral valve, it's going to be more and more granular. And we see again in a couple of very recent papers that have been published how we are on this very exciting time of stepping up our game for mitral valve disease, right? Things have been stagnant for about 10 years, but we are stepping up our game with the assessment of mitral regurgitation. Yeah, and now we are looking at these mitral valve finally from the viewpoint of the whole apparatus. And so we see how this Pringle shape with the more advanced disease processes gets flattened out. The annulus obviously becomes bigger because of left atrial and left ventricular dilation. And this is something that it's not trivial because we start to recognize how some of the mitral regurgitation, when we evaluate it, it's kind of the chicken and egg situation in which some of the mitral regurgitation is due to the prolapse, some of that is due to the annulus that expands, right? What we call functional mitral regurgitation. We are going one step further, this functional atrial mitral regurgitation because of the atrial enlargement, functional ventricular regurgitation. All of these things, all of this granular assessment of the shape of the mitral valve, it's going to be key for evaluating not only what is the best intervention for our dogs, which dogs are the best candidates for it, and what to expect after we fix the regurgitation. The lesson from human medicine, it's clear whenever you address the regurgitation because you fix the leaflets and you do not address the shape of the annulus, even surgically, you have much more reoccurrence and failure of the surgeries versus type of surgeries that try to also address the annular shape and reshape that annulus as a hyperbolic paraboloid. So I think it's very exciting times, and we are going to look at it again in a much more granular fashion with this availability of new techniques.
The beauty of this is the more you look into something, the more you find out. And then something that look like those are just some leaflets there, 2 leaflets opening and closing. And then the more you look at it, the shape matters, the shape has an impact on disease progression and so on. And that's really, really cool. Something that you have just recently published with goes towards the direction you were saying and is very interesting and would be good for you to describe is how can potentially breed differences in the mitral annulus shape affect disease progression or disease development and progression? Can you share with our listeners a bit what we have been doing with Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, and are there differences between mitral valve shape across different breeds?
That was a fun discovery. There was one that you kind of get into the project and you're like, well, I'm gonna look into it, but it's not gonna come out like nothing. And then the statistics software finishes, and you look at it like, that can't be true. Very good positive surprise to confirm that hypothesis of ours. We did find that. Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, which obviously they are very much predisposed to the development of the disease, before they even develop any degree of detectable mitral regurgitation, they seem to have a different annular shape in which that Pringle shape, that hyperbolic paraboloid, is lost. And we aren't sure whether it's lost or has never been there. But it's very interesting to us that when you look at dogs that have mitral regurgitation, regardless from the breed, they seem to have these more flat annulus, mitral valve annulus. But then when you look at dogs that you know that they will develop mitral valve disease in their life, before they even develop any mitral regurgitation, they already resemble those dogs with mitral regurgitation. So that kind of fuels our idea that the shape of the annulus may be something that contributes to the development of myxomatous degeneration. If it is there before you even develop a milliliter of MR, or at least what we can detect as a milliliter of MR, well, then it must have some causative importance to it, right? And there's pretty good data from people and from animal models also that shows that what the concept of MR that begets MR. So mitral regurgitation itself will trigger the expression of myxomatous proteins on the valve. There's these very early experiments in which they punched holes in mitral valve. If I remember well, I think they were sheep, but they found that a normal mitral valve that now has artificially creating mitral regurgitation will start expressing myxomatous proteins. And so that link between the mitral regurgitation, the stress on the mitral valve leaflets and on the apparatus, and that domino effect of myxomatous proteins seems to be there, and that's our main goal. So what we are looking at now, and we recently finished the statistical analysis, we are writing up the manuscript, is whether that shape is something that Cavalier King Charles Spaniels are born with. Now that we have, again, probes that can scan a couple of kilos Cavalier puppy, is it something that they're born with, or is this something that they develop very early in life as their heart changes shape? And how does that compare to dogs of other breeds that they're not so predisposed to mitral regurgitation? It either happens very early or it's there before you even get mitral regurgitation.
Wow.
It's very cool. Very, very cool.
Those poor Cavaliers, eh?
Yeah, I mean, they're the loveliest breed. I'm very happy. We always joke that I hate that they go through it, but from a very selfish researcher perspective, I'm very happy that that's the breed that gets this disease, because they're all lovely to echo. They have beautiful acoustic windows. Their owners are so dedicated. It's such a nice breed of dogs. And also from working with them standpoint, it's very, very nice.
Just thinking back, we were talking about mitral intervention and surgical and hybrid tear interventions, and of course down the line maybe we're going to be looking at interventional annuloplasties or hybrid chordae replacement. These things that are available for people where bypass is not their first choice option. They may be out there, I guess, for us down the line. One super important aspect of planning is finding the dogs who are most going to benefit from the surgery or the intervention, which makes me think about quantifying mitral regurgitation. Now, we've spoken to Brianna in another episode about making assessments for tear specifically and what that looks like to her, any red flags. How do you feel about the place of 3D echo in assessing mitral regurgitation severity? Can you see the hole on 3D? Can you measure the hole as a primary size, primary area, or is it not as easy as that?
It is as easy as that. The main limitation are the constraint that we talked about variability and frame rate. And as those get better and better, I think it's going to be a no-brainer to use that for that more granular stratification of patients. Yes, when you have these three-dimensional data sets that has been acquired, and again, that's the same. That's another thing that I think I failed to talk about earlier about when we talked about the efficiency of the process. Once you have acquired your volume, and it's a full volume data set, that's the same acquisition that you're going to use for your mitral valve, the same acquisition you're going to do for your left ventricular volume, the same for your left atrial volume, the same that you can use for your right ventricular volume. And it's one acquisition. So I think that also needs to take into account. But yeah, and the same acquisition that you can use for assessing the orifice of the regurgitation. There's a couple of different techniques that have been reported also in dogs. One is the one of looking at the actual size of the hole, right? What we call the anatomic regurgitant orifice area. Once you have that data set, you can scan and slice it however you want. And so you can put yourself in the left atrium or in the left ventricle looking down exactly perpendicular to that hole so that you can measure the area of the regurgitant orifice. There's limitations, obviously, of the variability of that assessment. That seems to be pretty high, at least when we did the study, even if it was like 7 years ago. So it will be interesting. That's another limitation that I don't like about our field that much, is that somebody does one study in 10 dogs and then nobody else ever produces that same study
or no
anymore.
journal wants to publish the repeat study.
No journal, exactly. But I think it's very important, particularly for these studies that only have a handful of dogs, and the technology has improved. I bet you now for the same study we would have a much better reproducibility and repeatability. So you can do that, or you can use the PISA method, but this time with a three-dimensional color Doppler. So we know that one of the limitations whenever we study it or we are teaching our trainers, one of the main limitations of the regular PISA method is that we always assume a circular orifice, right? We assume a circular orifice and those spheres are circular. Well, you don't have that with a 3D PISA. And so you can actually look at 3D color Doppler and calculate the volume of that, which is not anymore a hemisphere, but the volume of that going through, and calculate what is the effective regurgitant orifice area with 3D. and that it's more accurate than using the assumption of PISA. Probably from the tier standpoint, something that is even more accurate, particularly after the surgery, is that you can calculate several vena contracta, because then you're going to have two orifices, right? And so even the vena contracta can be used with a 3D color. Very important limitation, though, there, again, it's the frame rate. Whenever we talk about frame rate limitation, the color Doppler, it's what suffers the most from it. We go down, even with transesophageal color Doppler echocardiography, we go down to 10, 15 frames per second in a multi-beat acquisition. And you can understand how usually those are anesthetized dogs, so lower heart rate, but the moment in which you're measuring the mitral regurgitation matters, where you're at in systole. And so there, I suspect some, if not most, of the variability that we are seeing, it's due to that. We are just measuring the same thing, but at slightly different time points of systole.
It makes sense. And I think with the multiple jets factor, you've got to align with the vena contracta of multiple jets, and that introduces another variable factor, doesn't it? It's another opportunity for error, I guess. But it's very exciting to have these opportunities that allow us a much more detailed look at the reality of that MR, isn't it? Rather than just looking at, oh, that's a big jet, on 2D, which is what most people still do, I think.
And the one single recommendation for the use of 3D on the European Society and American Society of Echocardiography guidelines, actually, they do mention that when you're quantifying 3D volumes, if available, you should use 3D. And when you are quantifying mitral regurgitation by stroke volume method, so continuity equation, using 3D for your LV volumes, it is better, at least we know in people, we don't know yet in dogs, but it is better because, again, takes away the variability, the real true apex and things like that. So even when you're using 3D, not to look directly at the mitral regurgitation, incorporating it in your workflow for the stroke volume portion and full total stroke volume portion of the ventricle, for then subtracting the aortic stroke volume and coming up with the regurgitant volume, seems from the human experience superior to using other methods like the Simpson method of disc, for example.
I think the first time I realized that 3D it might be really a game changer was when we started doing 3D TOE or TE echo for our PDA cases. And we started realizing how oval the ostium is, because it looked like, okay, we measure the ostium and that's fine. But then when you start realizing that the large majority of cases, the ostium is really oval and is not a circle. And then where you measure will matter was really... Well, it was really eye-opener and really exciting. And you mentioned before about ASDs and so on. Can you tell us more? Because I think, as you were saying, I think interventional cardiology surgery might be really what will push forward 3D echo. So where else in interventional cardiology do you see that 3D echo is useful, or when do you use it in your lab?
Yeah, I totally agree. That's the single very practical use of 3D echo that we see, the classic oval PDA, and we will never know because we have to go back in time. But I bet a lot of devices, embolization or residual flow, have been avoided by looking at that and realizing how oval it is, and maybe changing a little bit your device choice intraoperatively from that, right? So that's we have TE and 3D TE in all our interventions in the cath lab. We are fortunate enough that we have an operator that is always available to perform our TE, and we try to look at our structures with 3D all the time. I think, as I mentioned, the PDAs are the probably the most widely available intervention that people have benefited from. When we are thinking, though, at left atrial decompression, I think that's one in which you probably do not want to do it. You can do it, but you do not want to do it without the help of a good 3D TE. You can definitely close a PDA without transesophageal echocardiography, right? But if you have it available, and the ones of us that use it all the time, we know how much better your life is by just being able to see that device, see where it is compared to the doctor, see whether there is residual flow right away. The left atrial decompression is where 3D TE makes a difference. Being able to without doing live mental reconstruction, without moving the probe, being able to visualize where your catheter is in the septum. I think it's key to successful procedure and safer procedures. There's a lot of
I think if you can't use that real-time 3D for those LADs, if you're trying to use a single plane, 2D TOE and fluoro, I think it's dangerous. I know I've heard of centers doing it, but boy, oh boy, in my experience, I know that Justin Allen and the guys from LA, they've done a lot of these. They're very confident with them. The way they talk about it sounds easy. I don't think it's that easy. And I think the imaging is absolutely critical. I completely agree. It's a safety issue to have that real-time 3D.
Yeah. And then the obvious elephant in the room is TEER, in which I think, again, being involved, we don't perform TEER at our center currently, but we were involved very, very, very early with the development of the device. And there were cases that were done successfully without 3D TE, but that was really, really a game changer for the learning curve. My understanding is for the learning curve of the center, how to optimize the visualization of the mitral valve and how to steer that device. That's done for the vast majority with T3D TE, because now you're handling a big device in the heart with in 3 dimensions, right? And understanding just the single plane and fluoroscopy where your movements are. You're always missing a plane, right? We were involved with another device early on. This was, again, probably at this point 7-10 years ago that we have published, and that too, the message from that company very early on was that you need to have 3D TE for guiding the device. And 3D TE, I think a lot of the not misconception, but a lot of people that have not used 3D TE, they always think about 3D TE as just the cool image in which you see the whole picture, the classic thing, which is the volume rendering image, right? The one that are usually used of yellows and things like that. But the value of 3D TE also comes from other methods, which are, for example, the X-plane, in which you can see 2 planes at the same time, right? To understand where you're at, or the value of a multiplane when Jose was talking about the oval PDA morphology. Like, it's very cool to position yourself in the ampulla and look down and see that it's oval. But whenever we get to measure it, we actually don't look at the images in 3D, but we need the 3D acquisition so that we can position ourselves perpendicular to it, right? And then do the measurements of 2 diameters or the area, and then you calculate the average of that. But anyway, I think a lot of it, even just a nice X-plane, it's again invaluable. It's a lot and makes everything safer. And for some of these things going on, it's going to be required. So again, my message is you want to be prepared. And so what you may see now, it's a waste of money or things like that, it can be an investment in which you are familiarizing yourself with some of these techniques, so that by the time there will be a requirement for a center to implement a certain interventions. You don't have to start from scratch for those, because the learning curve can be quite steep for some of these.
Now that we are getting towards the end, if there was any area that we didn't mention, we didn't discuss, Giulio, that you think would be important to touch, or final messages, something like that?
It can be discouraging. It can be hard. It can be seen, I think, as kind of pointless, right? At this point, why would I do that, particularly if you have a busy practice or anything? But I think there are things in the skill set of a cardiologist or of a sonographer that we don't get to use every day, right? That we have learned in our training, but the moment that you need them, being prepared to use them makes a difference. And so it's not different than many other things that we learn that we may not use every day, right? We have all learned how to calculate the regurgitant fraction by continuity equation, right? Do you do it in every patient with mitral disease? Absolutely not. But knowing how to do it, and knowing how to do it in a repeatable way, in a proficient way, knowing the pitfalls and the advantages of these are important. That's what makes the difference, right, between sonographers and cardiologists. And so I think, if anything, would be if you have the opportunity to start using it early, because we know from your own experience that it will make a difference, and I assume it will make a difference also in our patients. And being familiar with the technique, it's something that will come in handy.
I think as I've done more 3D echo, I think it's made me a better 2D imager, because it's made me think more about my alignment. I've understood how, I don't know, with advanced mitral valve disease, you get a little rotation of the valve compared to the papillary muscles that align with it. And so I think it's come to make me more critical of my 2D images. Do you feel the same way? Do you think that's a reasonable thing to consider?
Absolutely. And the LV volumes, for example, is the more humbling thing, right? When you think you've gotten to that apex, and then just at the end of the day, for fun, you look at your 3D volumes and you look at your 2D volumes with Simpsons, and you're like, oh boy, I was a little foreshortened there, wasn't I? And again, that may not make a clinical difference at this point, because all the normative data have been reported with 2D, right? Taking into account those technical limitations. But at the same time, it does make you think about being a better sonographer, looking at structures rather than images, if that makes sense, right?
And as you were saying before, I think AI will also turn this into a game changer, because the algorithms are just getting so much better and faster. And as you were saying, I said before that maybe we're going to be less lazy. I think we're going to be even lazier, because it's going to be, I think we still need to be very critical and assess the images and so on. But as you were saying, it's going to be 2 clicks to get a full volume. And that will be pretty good, and will trace the endocardial borders really well. So, which I think is exciting, because I think hopefully the field will grow really, really fast when all these offline workstations will have, really good.
Yeah, and as you save time, because you don't have to trace endocardial border, maybe you can invest the time into better quality image acquisition, right? It's a trade-off that is not obvious upfront, but...
Yeah.
I think even just spending more time, I either discussing the case with colleagues or communicating that to the owner. And if you save 20 minutes here and you can spend another 10 minutes discussing the challenges of that case with your colleagues, or presenting it at rounds and doing a better job with communication, that's a massive win from us as professionals, isn't it? And I know we all think of ourselves as echocardiographers, but we don't have to just do that. I think we can do more.
I totally agree. With echocardiography is obviously it's obviously what I love the most, but we are more than just sonographer, right? And so I agree that being able to save time, or being able to look at things in a more granular way, is something that is going to be it's going to be very cool. And I hope 3D Echo is going to help with that.
No, thank you so much for joining us today. Very insightful and really exciting stuff ahead. So yeah, keep up the good work. We keep checking your papers and
Thank you.
And thanks very much again for joining us today.
Thank you very much, guys. Bye. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. You've been listening to the Animal Heartbeat. If you'd like to reach us, email us on animalheartbeat@gmail.com.
Remember to like, follow, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and check out the website animalheartbeat.com.